It's time for Global Insight, where we speak to experts from around the world on issues making headlines. Now, most advanced economies have returned to business as usual after the two-year COVID-19 pandemic, but not everything has gone back to how it was before. The pandemic accelerated disruptions in labour markets globally, from millions of layoffs in the service sector, automation, remote work and flexible working hours, and a lot of different employment conditions. And the consequences have not only been limited to job loss in certain sectors, but there have also been significant labour shortages in key industries, with growing gaps in what businesses want from workers and how employees and job seekers see the value of work. Now, the scale of workforce transitions, it increases the need for businesses and policymakers to take steps to overcome this mismatch and move towards a brighter future of work. Now, to discuss these developments, we have in studio today Charles Ferguson, General Manager of the Asia Pacific region at Globalization Partners. A very good morning to you, Mr. Ferguson.
Good morning.
Thank you for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much.
It's lovely to see you. And well, my first question to you, really, we have quite a lot of questions, really. And over the last 2 years of the COVID-19 pandemic, we've seen many changes in the labour market.
Yes.
Of course, remote work, digitalisation just being a few of them. But what trends do you expect to be lasting changes, or even develop into more changes down the road?
It's a great question. Look, the reaction that a lot of companies had here in Korea and all around the world to the pandemic was pretty impressive if you think back on it. The pivot to making their entire workforce ostensibly remote. What's interesting to see is how that has impacted the way that work is being done now as we sort of exit the height of the pandemic episode and see a scenario where empowerment through choice and hybrid work is becoming the preferred way for companies and for workers to get things done. It's actually increasing productivity, and it's producing an environment of well-being for the employees that heretofore I don't think people truly understood was going to be so imperative for the future of work. So I think it's a really lasting result of this experiment to be, frankly, mainstream for the rest of the labour market.
Right, and many businesses are trying to adapt to these changes that they've seen, digitalisation, automation, and also workers wanting a bit more flexibility in how they work as well. But here in East Asia, though, countries like South Korea and Japan, they're quite known for their very rigid corporate cultures, very intense, all around the clock working, but not necessarily as productive as they might hope. So are you starting to see some changes in these very rigid, stringent corporate cultures after the pandemic?
Yeah, there are quite a few, and I think it's a hark back to the adage that necessity is the mother of invention. I think that it is indeed the case that here in this region and all around the world, there's been a marked increase in employees kind of voting with their feet, if you will, and looking for new opportunities. In that kind of environment where there's so much volatility from a traditional environment where the work was employment for life construed, now there's quite a bit of choice. And when you put a remote construct into that equation, companies have to really sit back and say to themselves, our strategy is flawless, our product is fantastic, the market opportunity is huge, but the only way to be successful in those types of conditions is with a very agile workforce. So what we see, you mentioned earlier in one of the earlier segments, this sort of disruption in the labor markets that's occurring here in Korea and abroad. The opportunity for a company to not only look at jobs to be done in the domestic environment, but how do we build diversity into our workforce and have balance across multiple locations and have that agility be woven into our DNA? So I think that I agree with you that traditionally companies in Northeast Asia have primarily relied upon a tried and true method of hierarchical management. But I think that as the younger generations come into the workforce and as technology puts pressure on these more I wouldn't say antiquated, but these previous models, they're going to have to innovate in order to remain competitive, both domestically for talent and globally in the market.
Exactly, and well, we've seen this in the US. We've seen businesses reopening, but they're not having enough workers to work in them because people simply aren't going back to work. And perhaps we're seeing that here in South Korea as well. We've seen a huge growth in the number of delivery jobs and a lot of platform economy jobs, gig workers.
Yes.
But many don't seem to be going back to traditional service jobs. So what do you really make of this mismatch? What are your observations of this labor shortage?
You know, as it relates to the service industry, I mean, it's clearly the case that you can't necessarily apply a remote work kind of construct to that kind of labor, because obviously service is by its very nature needed to be face-to-face. But I do think that a lot of this is cyclical, and it's a phase of transition where the economy and the labor that's supporting that economy is going to start to become much more, you mentioned like gig work as an example. There will be instances where people do work in cycle, and they'll have the opportunity to do more information worker type delivery of value in a remote construct. You know, we think about, look at Korea as an example. It's a phenomenal opportunity for businesses to, in Korea, expand abroad at this time. It's also a huge opportunity for companies looking at the Korean market because of the wealth of talent that's actually in the labor pool here. But what's interesting about that, when you think about the global employment market, companies can actually employ the talent here in this market without having to be present in this market. And that's a tremendous opportunity for the Korean economy.
So we're seeing employment conditions becoming perhaps a little more global, a bit more flexible, and people are certainly demanding a better work-life balance, and
Absolutely.
they do want that room to sort of maneuver around the world. But then this might be somewhat of a headache for global businesses, though, you know, adapting to regulations and employment conditions which differ by country. So how do businesses, how can they actually adapt to this change that we're seeing and what employees want in terms of location?
You know, the traditional method was to pack up your bags and get on a plane and fly to the location, establish the infrastructure, and then sort of trial and error until you got it right. Because of the ubiquity of technology and the way and means by which information flows all around the world, and the way that e-commerce has taken over as the fundamental foundation of the economy around the world, companies need to really look at partnerships with strong players that are in the business of providing these specific types of services. So the companies are going to be successful in this new globalized kind of labor access market are the ones who take the opportunity to understand, of course, the local conditions, but also the regulations and the compliance. You know, if you think about a business's investments as they look at how they're going to expand and scale their growth in the business, the number one expense, which is a reasonable expense because we all want to work, but it's 70% plus is into the labor costs of the business. So that means, of course, that you have to be very judicious and very careful with how you make that investment, but moreover, how you manage it. And that's where that compliance angle really comes in. So partnership with a good, locally present business that's in the job and in the business of taking care of HR machinations is paramount to success.
Right, and actually your company, Globalization Partners, you released a report yesterday talking about how CFOs in the Asia-Pacific region, despite all the global economic challenges that we face, all the uncertainties, they still want to expand into our new countries over the next few years.
That's right.
Could you share some more findings from this study that you did?
It was really interesting. So we went around the world and spoke to a vast ecosystem of CFOs who, from a background perspective, manage the finance business of $100 million or more in terms of the revenue that they enjoy. And as it relates specifically to Asia-Pac, the feedback that we got was really, it wasn't surprising to me. I was quite excited about it, but I think it was surprising on the global spectrum. 92% of those CFOs responded with the fact that indeed they see the opportunity of expansion as critical for their business. 77% of those also said that in conjunction with that, the opportunity to deploy a remote work sort of environment from a strategic perspective is critical for their success and scale. And 56% of those also responded with the idea that at a very minimum, the advent of flexible work will become part and parcel of the benefits they provide to their employees. So that statistic around the look out for new markets to penetrate really speaks to the optimism and, in my view, pragmatism of some of these financial leaders, because they see that if we're having a challenge in a domestic market and we see challenges in other markets, for every challenge there's an opportunity. So the way to hedge against that is to look for opportunities for growth as well as for talent in multiple markets in serial rather than in parallel, which is the traditional method.
Right, so looking for areas of new growth, innovation, all these new exciting possibilities for the region. And of course, South Korea is one of the countries in the Asia Pacific. And from a talent perspective, though, what really attracts businesses to expand into the South Korean market, and how can South Koreans really leverage this kind of opportunity?
You know, South Korea is such a dynamic and incredible market, and it always has been. Since the end of World War II, where you saw this incredible rate of change with respect to literacy here in the Korean market, and the way that the people and the government have focused in on not only developing a culture of learning, but a culture of curiosity and innovation. As you look at what's happening now in the Korean sort of global spectrum, it's very obvious that artificial intelligence and digital transformation and general sorts of access to bleeding edge technologies are born and bred here in this marketplace. So that attracts not only businesses that are interested in those specific areas, and I mentioned AI and digital transformation and telecommunications, mobility, and silicon, but it's also the ancillary industries around that. So indeed, it is the case that companies want to tap into that talent. They want to explore those specific verticals as it relates to this market. But moreover, Korean businesses also are taking these amazing innovations and these learnings and taking them all around the world, almost like ambassadors of innovation and growth. So there are ecosystems that can support that. And that's why this market, for me and for my company, is such a dynamic and important market for us to invest in.
And while it wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that South Korea, its secret to its huge economic growth over the past few decades, that has been down to its brilliant human capital, I believe. And
100%.
And in going forward as well, managing human talent, capital, it's going to be vital to any business's success. And in terms of doing that, I believe there are some technologies that companies like yourself are adopting and using. And could you tell us what HR tech really is and what future you see for the technology?
Yeah, the interesting about the way that HR has started to evolve, historically, it was viewed as sort of a management science around personnel and administration, right? And what's fascinating about it now, particularly I think it's been accelerated by what's happened through the course of the pandemic, is that people realize that managing the asset of the human capital and automating process around that to enable scale at a rapid pace is the way of the future. I mentioned earlier that this is your most critical investment in your business, regardless of your size, whether you're a large business like Samsung or you're a small startup here in Seoul who's looking to go abroad. The only way to be successful is by effectively managing, nurturing, and growing your talent. So the science of that and the art of that management is predicated upon your ability to gain speed and efficiency. And the way to do that is with a tool, and the tool is technology. So we're seeing platforms like what we bring to the market, leveraging things like artificial intelligence, like machine learning, like robotic process automation, which takes, heretofore viewed as rote process or workflow, and automates that so that the experts who used to have to do that stuff manually are now able to take their expertise and apply it to human interaction. At the end of the day, we should never forget that tech is great, but when it comes to HR, it's all about the people.
Right, and how do you see the potential of South Korean companies expanding globally, and how are you planning to partner with them?
Look, I'm speaking actually this week at the Next Rise conference here in Seoul, which is focused on the startup ecosystem. We see 70% of the businesses that we work with around this region, and certainly it's the case here in Korea, are startup businesses, and the vast majority of them are in software, online services, and technologies. So we look at these businesses and we see kind of the use case of what we do in two different lights. One is, indeed, I want to have speed to market so I can explore a new market before I make the significant investments of going in and really setting up shop. So they'll use our service to hire local talent and then see if there's product market fit. The other way that some startups are starting to leverage this type of a model is to say we have a dearth of talent in our local market, but by virtue of time zone and maybe linguistic capability, we can broaden our search for talent into new markets. Sometimes those are lower cost, sometimes they might be higher cost, but on average, when you look at the impact to the business, it's all about time to value. How fast can we get to the market and get that talent and retain that talent? And so technology and partnerships are going to enable that.
Right, and as you said, with 70% of companies' costs going into labour, it's going to be very critical for companies all over the world, really, to be able to manage their most important asset, which, of course, is its people.
Exactly right.
And while we're looking forward to more news and updates from your speech that you're making at the conference that you'll be holding here in South Korea.
But I'm looking forward to it.
Well, thank you very much for joining us in the studio today. That was Charles Ferguson, General Manager of the Asia Pacific region at Globalization Partners. Thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you.